Wow, I seem to be on a streak here. Must be the new format. Welcome to episode 6 of Tales of Mystara, a podcast all about playing Dungeons & Dragons solo, setting games on the hollow planet of Mystara, and using the basic rules which were popular throughout the 80s and 90s, a lost relic which should not just be valued for its importance in history, but enjoyed in the present, because there is so much resource here that is sure to benefit the modern tabletop gamer. So, at time of recording, it's been about a week since my last episode. Just put out another instalment of my Castle of the Quest series on my YouTube channel at Solo Dungeon Crawler. This is to date the longest video I've ever made, clocking in at a whopping 50 minutes. I'm really diving into the rules of original 1974 D&D, playing as close to the rules as written as a solo game allows. But the whole thing is not really about the solo campaign, but about casting our minds back to a time when the fantasy role-playing game was still evolving out of the wargaming culture, and looking at rules that have been lost, cast aside, or misinterpreted over the years. So if this sounds like something of interest, then feel free to take a look. So last week I had a comment from John of Tale of the Manticore fame, who was asking me what the difference is between a yes and a yes because in my D8 Oracle. If you don't know Tale of the Manticore, firstly, I'm surprised that's the case, and secondly, go listen to this podcast. As far as I'm aware, this is the world's second ever actual play solo Dungeons & Dragons podcast, Iron Realm being the original trailblazer who marked the path through the treacherous forest in 2015, I think. We got Tale of the Manticore in April of 2020, and there was Subclass Act in November of the same year, using the basic fantasy rules. So not strictly D&D, but also it kind of is if you count retro clones. I started this one in January of 2021. Now we have quite a few, which is awesome. But there has been plenty of YouTube gamers doing solo TTRPG content for some time, including giants like me, myself and Di. And there's obviously geek gamers who have been at it for more than 7 years. These are just a few of the mentions, and I'm no expert, so I'm positive there are more than just the ones I know, scattered throughout the digital galaxy and stretching out to its very fringes. As a digression, I think having that output like some audio or video or a blog helps solidify the approach of the solo TTRPG gamer. So I'm not surprised at the evolution and the growth. I started playing solo D&D on and off about 12 or so years ago, but until I started formalising it into videos, audio, etc., I'd never had so much fun. But back to John's question, what's the difference between yes and yes because? Does the bridge look safe to cross? Might be a question for an oracle. Yes. Seems a bit inadequate. It doesn't really add anything to the emergent world. Yes, because offers some opportunities to address this. Here's a few examples. Yes, because as you approach the bridge, you notice a faint, magical glow surrounding it. It seems to be a protective ward, indicating that the bridge is enchanted to withstand external forces. Yes, because, upon closer inspection, you see that the bridge is expertly crafted with sturdy dwarven engineering. The stone pillars and iron supports suggest that it was built to last. Yes, because the bridge is adorned with delicate elven runes that resonate with an aura of protection. It appears that the elves have blessed this bridge for safe passage. Makes sense? Let's see what's happening with my adventuring party in my game. The characters are in the Palace of Evendur, awaiting the half moon, so they can use the half moon engraved key to unlock a door behind the palace's throne room, which appears to open into a mysterious garden. You'll note I tend to flitter between past and present tense sometimes when recapping. Figured I was doing this by accident, but I've settled on the following excuse. I'm adapting the narrative tense as a stylistic choice, depending on how I want to convey the story to my listeners. At this point, this really is an excuse, but maybe now I've made myself consciously aware of what I'm doing, my excuse might become a real stylistic choice. Let me know if it bothers you and I'll work on it. When last we left off, the throne room had been invaded by a chaotic cleric, a servant of the immortal Arik, who fled the palace after being questioned more closely by Ilyena. I'll recap the events of one of my solo gaming sessions from here. The party wanted to pursue, but the stranger had a 70% chance to evade, and she succeeded. "She's gone, let her go," said Ilyena. "Well, whatever she has, she's got away with it," Yolanda said, disappointed. Ilyena let out a sigh. She then proceeded to break the news about the half-moon engraved key not being effective until night falls. While the party were discussing their next move, Ilyena, who had been idly examining the area around the half-moon door, suddenly moved up to the throne, drawn to it, noticing it had a faint glow. Could it have been her imagination? It seemed to have gone. Perhaps it was never there. She scrutinized the throne, which seemed fairly mundane, a trick of light caused by the skylight in the ceiling. She shrugged. A harmless throne. She felt compelled then to take a seat, thinking that this unique vantage point may offer some kind of clue as to avoid any more of Evendur's old security measures. At least that was her rationale. So, what's going on here? In the adventure module, which is still a work in progress of mine, the dungeon key detailing the throne room says, "The dungeon master should present the throne's presence in an appealing way to lure a character to sit. This technique will be used to roleplay the magic lure of the throne. No saving throw is required, as the player's ability to resist should be authentic. When a character sits down, 1d8 fire beetles hidden inside the throne will suddenly crawl out." Notice this key entry seems very much aimed at a group of players as opposed to a solo game. There's a reason for that. You might remember what Gary Gygax said in Strategic Review Issue 1 regarding his Solo Dungeon Adventures article. Save what you develop, for if you decide not to continue each solo game as part of a campaign, the levels developed in this manner can often be used in multiplayer games. Likewise, keep a side record of all monsters, treasures, tricks, traps, and whatever. If the opportunity ever comes, as it most probably will, you will have an ample supply of dungeon levels and matrices to entertain other players. And as I mentioned before, I'm trying to improve an adventure module I wrote a while back, which still needs a lot of work, which is exactly why I am solo adventuring through this module. The key entry did not previously exist. I created it through randomness with an experiment I'd been trying out. I've covered this in more detail before, and I'm pretty sure it was in this Tales of Mystara series. The experiment in question is the technique of switching perspectives in your solo game. So you're not always perceiving it from the point of view of a player. Sometimes you're switching so that you are the dungeon master instead. The reason I like to use this technique ultimately is to avoid metagaming. Sometimes I just enjoy DMing. So essentially, a kind of primitive AI is used to run player actions. And by AI, I do not mean chat GPT. I mean good old-fashioned dice and tables. That doesn't mean you can't use AI. I'm not condemning its use. I've messed around with it a few times, and maybe at some point I'll take a closer look, but I do love being analog as much as I can, especially when playing with the classic books. So bringing the focus back to the throne room and Ilyena sitting on the throne, I realised that plenty of time would need to pass before darkness fell, and the key could potentially be used to unlock the door into the mysterious garden. I was at a loss of what the party might want to try, because as the author of the module, I know all its intricacies, and so it's hard to make a decision without being influenced by that knowledge. The knowledge I have that the characters wouldn't. This was a perfect time to switch perspective from player to DM. To handle random player actions, I have a rather complicated table to roll on, which has different columns to break up these actions into what I like to call specific actions, generic actions, and class actions. Specific actions are things like listen, open door, search for a secret door, and so on. Generic actions are a lot more flexible and less specific, just random words like touch, climb, untie, read, push, collect. They are a bit more broad and all-encompassing. They don't relate necessarily to specific actions tied to game mechanics, while the specific actions do. Class actions relate directly to the character classes, move silently, cast spell, and so on. You can get quite creative with this and really bring different character classes to life. I have a dwarf action of inspect stonework, and I also have a sound analysis action tied to a game mechanic I created based on some rules I found in the AD&D Dungeoneer's Survival Guide. All the specific actions and class actions are tied to game mechanics. Generic actions are different. Each roll on the generic actions column provides 3 random words. These are designed to be used with an oracle. To use them, you have to ask yourself, in the context of the current scenario, what question might a D&D character of a said class ask the Dungeon Master that involves the generic actions. And then, interpreting the results of the oracle, the narrative moves forward. With the generic actions, because they're tied to an oracle, and as I've said previously, I do try to limit the use of oracles and let the game mechanics do most of the work for me. Generic actions are only used when specific and class actions don't apply to the current context or the current scenario. I know people are going to ask to see this character actions table, and a primitive version which just had generic actions in it was provided in one of my solo D&D tutorial videos, if I recall, but it's evolved quite a bit since then. I'm not going to show it to you for a few reasons. Reason one being, it is a work in progress that is far from complete. And reason number two is, if you like the idea, as I've explained it just now, then make your own table based on this idea. A table like this should be designed specifically to the setting, the rules, and the game that you're playing. Your own play style and the way you envision your individual character classes. It's personal. The third reason is that someday when I feel like I've settled on an approach I really like with solo games, I will put something substantial together to share, but only if I think it will add any value and encourage people to be more creative. To me, it feels like the important part is the thought process behind it. That's the most valuable part. For me, half the fun in playing solo is figuring out how to do it in a way that helps me create the kind of game I want to play. If you're anything like me, then you don't want to see my tables. I probably don't want to see yours. I'd like to hear about why you made them and what they're for. The ideas behind them might strike a chord. So for me, that's the important part. It's the intention and the original vision behind the mechanic that you created. That's what I'm interested in. So I'm looking at the game from the DM's perspective. I use my crude AI to decide what the characters do. This is a really useful approach when testing out an adventure module too, because it gives me the opportunity to have the players throw something surprising at me, which will help me flesh out more details for the adventure. That's exactly what happened here. Ilyena, through my random table, decided to sit on the throne, and two things influenced me in deciding what happened next and why. The first influence was the rationalization of why she sat on the throne. My answer to this was she felt compelled to do it. The second influence was reasoning why sitting on the throne mattered. What effects would it produce? I asked a complex question of the oracle for this one, and this triggered a random encounter with fire beetles. So the last line in the key was added. When a character sits down, 1d8 fire beetles hidden inside the throne will suddenly crawl out. Let's look at what happened next. No sooner than she reclined, Ilyena was suddenly crawling with giant beetles, and the d8 dictated that 3 glowing beetles about 2.5 feet long each crawled up Ilyena's legs towards her torso. Then, the d6 dictated that Ilyena froze, unable to move from sheer surprise. The monster reaction roll indicated that the beetles were aggressive but would not attack. So the glands on the beetles' abdomen and above their eyes glue red with a fiery heat. They appeared to be angered by the disturbance of the throne. A -8 penalty was imposed to their next reaction roll. so Ilyena needed to think fast to avoid being bitten, as just one bite from any of these beetles could be deadly. The initiative roll brought about a tie. The characters decided to remain completely still to avoid further angering the creatures. I had Ilyena roll against her wisdom with a -5 penalty to attempt to soothe the creatures by remaining still and calm and avoiding threatening body language of any sort. She had to roll below a 6 on a d20 to succeed. But, as initiative was tied, the results would not apply until the second round of the encounter. She rolled a 9. The beetles remained angered by her presence. "I really wish she hadn't sat on that throne," said Yolanda in a desperate plea. Their next reaction roll dictated that they would attack. Ilyena abruptly got to her feet, managing to brush away 2 of the giant bug attacks, but one of them bit for just 2 damage. As Ilyena cried out in pain, there was a flicker of light, and the beetles vanished into thin air. The characters all had a look of confusion, but the encounter was over at least. Ilyena rubbed at the painful bite mark and tried to shake off the strange event. A moment later, the pain faded away completely, along with any trace of the bite. "It was the wish," Yolanda and Cathbad said with excitement in unison. "Yolanda wished that you never sat on the throne, and here we are," continued Cathbad. "The beetles were never disturbed. You were never bitten." As Yolanda was granted this wish, Ilyena is now back to her full 6 hit points. She was never bitten. "Try not to touch anything else without checking it first," Yolanda said, patronisingly. The power of the Oracle and the character AI struck again here. Through a random character action, Yolanda spoke. I have a little procedure in place when it comes to handling each particular round in a game. As I said in episode 4, at least I think it was 4, may have been 5, I use an adventure journal to record the events of the adventure. In the margin, I note the turn number and round number, and then I record the events next to it. These events for each individual portion of time are segmented into description, questions, actions, and roleplay. This gives a little organisation to the unfolding of the narrative and stops me from missing anything important out, keeping the flow of the game consistent. The description is just a brief description of the scenario as it currently stands. This is an imitation of the Dungeon Master describing the present conditions to the player. Next come the questions. This is the opportunity for me to clarify anything that might affect the actions I choose for the characters, and is an imitation of players asking the DM questions to help them clarify the situation in their own minds. Next come the actions the characters perform, which are adjudicated according to the rules, and the outcome is determined. Finally comes the roleplay segment, which I like to include to bring the characters to life a little in accordance with their character traits, which, as I discussed in previous episodes, are organised into a virtue, a vow, and a vice. It is the roleplay segment that brought about Yolanda's wish. My random dialogue table brought about dialogue relating to legends and rumours. This is a fine example of tailoring random tables to the specific game you are playing. If you have ever played any of the modules set in Mystara, They often have random legends and rumours tables, and characters have a chance to know some of these, whether true or false. So I brought this into my solo rules. Yolanda had heard the following legend/rumour. The palace has been enchanted with the power to grant wishes, if they are spoke out loud. And so she, through random determination, spoke a wish out loud. The description of the Palace of Evendur in the adventure module says, when player characters are inside the palace, they are granted 3 wishes. These 3 wishes are shared across the whole adventuring party. No clue should be offered regarding the availability of wishes, but if a character speaks out loud that they wish for something, then the wish will be granted on the following round, 10 seconds later. Returning to the palace after leaving it does not replenish used up wishes. After 3 wishes have been granted, the magic is all used up. Just a quick note here. You don't need to understand these mechanics of mine inside out. Just trying to give you some inside knowledge of how I play. My intention is to offer some inspiration for anyone who wants to experiment with these concepts, but I can't stress enough that adapting things to suit your own game is really effective in bringing the system or setting you're playing to life. I'm also constantly changing things to suit my needs, so my system becomes more robust over time, but is pretty malleable, so these recaps are an expression of my approach at the time. See, you'll probably notice a fair bit of Oracle use in this session recap. With the malleability I just mentioned, I'm actually hammering out a lot of use of Oracles, as I don't want them to be a driving factor in my games. I want them as a fallback mechanism, so as things progress you'll start to notice some changes. In fact, if you've seen my Castle of the Quest series on YouTube, there's a lot less Oracle use in that. I think Oracles are more easily avoided when procedurally generating adventures from scratch, but in playing pre-written adventures they have a lot more fun uses, especially in this case where the module is something I'm actively working on. The Oracle is then a pretty good tool for fleshing out the design of an adventure. And to end the episode, let's wrap up the current scene. Let's start by checking this door, Yolanda continued, gesturing over to the door on the west wall. We have nothing better to do, Ilyena responded with a shrug, and places her arm over Yolanda's shoulder as they both approach the door, followed closely by Cathbad, who stepped forward to open it, which he did without resistance. Tune in next time to find out what happens next. And thanks for listening. See you next session.